Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Josh Archibald Seiffer. I am a second-year master's student in music composition here at the University of Washington. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about the direction of modern classical music and an idea that I like to call the new expressivity, which I like to think of as a fresh and innovative way of defining what exactly music is and what it's capable of. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about where we've come from with our music tradition. So, classical music over the course of the centuries has adopted these codified emotional cues. In other words, we hear certain sounds that in our culture have come to make us feel a certain way. We have kind of a programmed emotional response to these things. And we have lots of different musical parameters in which this can happen. Things like melody, rhythm, harmony, timbre, tone quality. There are a variety of things that we can implement that have become part of this codified emotional cueing system. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. Here's the first one. So, this is music that most of us would probably classify as being sad or sorrowful, and there's a reason for that. We have these low kind of plodding notes that work their way along sort of trudgingly. We have these high, almost sobbing sounding violin gestures, and the piece is written in what we refer to in music as a minor key. In other words, the notes are arranged in certain patterns that as a culture we've come to understand as representing sadness, or depending on the context, maybe even anger. Let's listen to a contrasting example of that now. Definitely different. A lot of people would classify this as being playful or happy. We have these short, kind of quick string notes that happen at the beginning. The music is presented in short little phrases, play a little, stop a little. And again, kind of using musical terms, it's written in a major key. So the notes are arranged in a way that we perceive as being happy. So when we listen to things like this, the emotional responses that we have tend to inform whether we think of music as being expressive or not. Let's clarify that a little bit. What exactly is expressivity? Well, in art, in our culture, we often think of this as the ability to convey emotions or feelings. And this goes across many different genres of art. We see this in poetry. We hear these Cyrano de Bergerac-style romantic outpourings, or a more contemporary example might be the emo poetry that finds its way into live journals. We also have, in the visual arts, a lot of artists are praised for their ability to capture emotion in their subjects' faces, or possibly to capture the tension or the energy of a certain scene. And as we just heard, we can do this in music using some of these codified emotional cues that we've developed over time. This had been going on for quite a while, though, by the time we reached the 20th century, and a lot of composers began to seek new ways of organizing sound and doing different sorts of things. Admittedly, some of their ideas involved things that are a bit harsh on the ears, but at the same time, and more importantly really, they're breaking away from these traditional cultural cues that we are all so used to. And they're moving in so many different directions that we no longer have a unifying foundational language that we can understand everything with. As a result of this, a lot of people would perceive modern music as being disorienting and kind of confusing, such as in this example. It's a little different from what we heard. Because we don't have the same sort of emotional cue language function built in to understand what's happening here in the way that we're used to, many people dismiss modern music as being not particularly expressive because it doesn't work within that system that we're so used to. This is where the idea of the new expressivity comes in. I'd like to propose that while we can certainly express emotions, and that's crucially important, we can also express ideas, and sometimes we forget about that. Anybody who's ever had to write an essay or any sort of document is familiar with the idea of needing to express their ideas and articulate them clearly. And in fact, maybe almost a better word to encompass what we could possibly be doing with music and other forms of art is to think of them as being communicative. Expressive is almost sort of a loaded term now because we associate it with feelings and emotions. If we think about communication, it actually broadens this idea so that we have both emotions on the table and intellectual and maybe more abstract concepts. And in fact, we actually have other works of art that do this. Let me show you an example. This is a painting by Georges Braque called Violin and Candlestick. Braque, along with Picasso, was one of the pioneers of the Cubist movement back in the earlier parts of the 20th century. Now, the subject matter of this painting isn't particularly emotionally riveting. It's a violin and a candlestick. That's nothing particularly exciting. But what we have here is an idea. One of the main tenets of Cubism is this idea that we can take our three-dimensional world and represent it from multiple perspectives and then put it into two dimensions, which is why we have this very fractured sort of appearance. So, as we work with this, we can also apply this sort of theory to music. And this seems a little bit bizarre at first, but in our innovative environment of the 21st century, I'd like to encourage composers and listeners alike to flock to this kind of communication and to explore its potential. Additionally, in the 21st century, we have new avenues of progressive thinking and modern technology that are available to us to help us do this. What I'd like to do is give you a concrete example of how this can be put into action. I'd first like to present you with an abstract concept that I've worked with in some of my music that I've written. I'd like to talk about some of the tools I've had available to me, more specifically as a modern composer, and then I'd like to show you how all of this can weave together in a work of mine. So to begin with, let's talk about this intellectual idea. And this idea is the uncanny. This is simply one that I chose. There are many out there to pick from, but this is one that interested me. So first, let's figure out what this means. What exactly is the uncanny? Simply put, it's something that is not quite right. Essentially, we take something that is very familiar to us, something that's very close and comfortable, but it's been subtly altered in kind of an unsettling and unnerving way. Typically, this type of alteration is going to be something that defies our cultural knowledge and our understanding of what we're used to and what seems normal. And because of that, because we've changed something so familiar to us, it subverts our level of comfort with it, and it creates sort of an uneasiness. It seems a little abstract. Let me give you a more concrete example of this. Here's a picture of Margaret Thatcher, looking her best, I presume. Here's another picture of Margaret Thatcher. Kind of frightening, actually. So I would posit that these two pictures actually have an uncanny relationship to one another, and here's why. If I showed you a picture of Margaret Thatcher as such, and then showed you a picture of the alien monster from Cloverfield, that is not an uncanny relationship, because we see Margaret Thatcher and then something totally different, which, while maybe scary, there's no sense of familiarity between the two. So that does not define the uncanny. If I showed you this picture of Margaret Thatcher and then showed you a painting of her frowning, that isn't really either, because we understand that people can express different emotions with their faces. They can smile and they can frown. So we have the change, we have a subtle change that's happened, but it's something that we understand and makes sense to us. But when we see this, her eyes and her mouth are in the right place, but they're oriented incorrectly. People's eyes don't look like this typically, and the mouth doesn't look like this, and we don't have a clear way of explaining why that looks the way it does. Therefore, because it's something familiar to us that's been altered, Margaret Thatcher, and also just the human form, it becomes uncanny in the way that we perceive it. Now, as a side note, the uncanny, dealing with it as an intellectual and abstract concept, does play into people's emotions a little bit. That was something that I personally was very interested in dealing with. So we can, at times, have the intellectual and the emotional working in connection with one another. So that talks about the uncanny. Let me discuss some of the tools at my disposal as a modern composer that I can use to try to represent this or demonstrate this. One of these is the use of technology. We first start to see pure electronic music rising probably around the 1950s. It's a lot of kind of beeps and bloops, at least at first, things you might expect from Atari games. And all done using analog circuits, digital signal processing. I'm sorry, not digital yet, just signal processing. Then, as time went on, a lot of these things were converted over to digital means, and as our computers have gotten faster, able to store more information, composers have more and more options available to them for their artistic use. So some of the things that we can do with electronic music, we have the ability to custom build new sounds. Let's say that as a composer, you're interested in creating a certain type of sound that you don't really have an instrument that can create it. There are ways that we can build these, kind of synthesizing different little bits together. Another thing that we can do is exercise very precise control over our musical parameters. Let's say that I have a note that I want to change tone color very slowly over the course of 5 minutes. Very hard for a live performer to regulate that, but this allows for extremely gradual and subtle change, similar to what we talked about with the uncanny. Finally, another thing that we can do is alter existing sounds beyond the typical realm of physics and acoustical laws. I can take a recording of something and change it in a way that we would never hear it in the natural world, creating a change that is unfamiliar to us and that does challenge what we acknowledge as being normal and accepted. So, technology. Another thing, kind of in a progressive line of thinking we can deal with, is a different approach to the use of text in music. We use text in music very frequently, usually in the form of lyrics of some sort or another. The lyrics can tell a story, they can talk about feelings or experiences, but the focus is on their meaning, really the meanings of the words and what they're saying overall. Let's think outside the box a little bit. First of all, what if the text were a little bit more independent and not quite so tied to all of the notes? What if it were maybe spoken? We have that a little bit in rap music, but it still incorporates the rhythm. Let's separate the text even more, make it extremely independent. Then, what if we dealt with the idea of using a very small amount of text, very, very small, and over the course of a piece, all of the words retain their normal meanings, but we change the text little by little. We rearrange it in such a way that we're actually proving another point and changing what we originally thought we were hearing. So on this level, we can have words that retain their original meaning and then being transformed in a way that gives them a whole other meaning. I know at this point this is starting to get a little bit abstract. So let's talk about a piece of mine called And Some That Aren't. This was a piece completed this last winter. It's written for recorded voice and computer-realized sound. In other words, sound that is made using computers, the digital means I talked about, or takes recorded sounds and alters them a bit. The recorded voice part of this piece, which was recorded by a UW student, actually, just recites this poem. This is all the recording that I have from the voice. It's a short, kind of nursery rhyme-like poem. Over the course of the piece, we hear this poem repeated a number of times. And as it repeats, it builds up familiarity with the audience, but it also changes very subtly each time. Let me give you an example. Here's a line out of the second stanza of the poem, and when you wake, I'm sure you'll find. Let's listen to how it actually sounds in the piece.
And when you wake, I'm sure you'll find.
Okay? After a little while, we will
sure
have heard this.
And when you'll find.
Well, that's what it sounds like. I'll play it again in a second. After we hear this a number of times, we then hear an altered version that sounds like this.
I'm sure you wake, and when you'll find.
Very small change. It's almost a little nonsensical, and when you'll find, it doesn't really work. The reason for this is if we've heard our speaker talk for quite a while, we know that she is perfectly capable of saying the sentence completely normally. But suddenly it's a little bit off. There's something a little bit weird. Why would she suddenly kind of malfunction and switch these words and make them nonsensical? Let me give you a more dramatic example. Here we see an example. These are the last 3 lines of this poem. It's only there inside your mind. Actually, I'll let the speaker read it for you. So here's what this sounds like.
It's only there inside your mind. When you wake, I'm sure you'll find yourself still safe at home.
After about 5 minutes or so of transformation and hearing this gradually changing, we end up with the following.
It's only when you wake that you'll find yourself still safe at home.
So what we've done, these words are retaining their original meaning, and because they are actually recorded, they stay the same in terms of their inflection and their length. They all stay very familiar and what we've been hearing all along. The difference, though, is by the time we get to the end, we have an extremely different meaning from the comfortable nursery rhyme-like atmosphere that was created before. Therefore, doing this in this way, we build up familiarity and break from it. We twist it so that we have this uncanny sensation. I'm not able to show you the entire process of how these changes accrue over the course of the whole piece, but what I'd like to do is give you a little taste of what happens at the beginning of the piece, and then what happens about 5 minutes later after it's transformed considerably, just to show you the capability and power that we have with electronic music. So here's a bit out of the beginning of the piece. It's just the second stanza of the poem as it actually appears in the work.
But don't be frightened of traveling alone. Whatever your journey, no matter what kind, it's only there inside your mind. And when you wake, I'm sure you'll find yourself still safe at home.
So what we hear happening here, for the most part, this is very comfortable, but that very last line, it comes in a little bit quietly, but we hear the voice pull apart from itself as she says, yourself still safe at home. We hear this little bit of pulling apart. This is what I mean by being able to control parameters very finely using electronic music. That's something bizarre that we weren't expecting. 5 minutes later into the piece, after this transformation has taken place, let's listen to where we end up.
You pass through the nights. It's only silently. Stop traveling alone. Be frightened of your journey. It's only safe. Don't be sure you'll find yourself. Be frightened of your journey. It's only silently. Pass through the nights. Be frightened of your journey. You'll find. Have yourself a life. It's always silent. Have your
And if you wake,
So, over the course of this piece, we have this transformation that takes place. The place that we end up has subverted the comfort that we originally had with this kind of nursery rhyme sort of feel. It's changed significantly. The text has been rearranged to say things like, be frightened of your journey, as opposed to don't be frightened of traveling alone. Very gradually, we create this change so that our level of comfort is turned around, and therefore we can embody this idea of the uncanny. So in conclusion, abstract ideas can be communicated through music. This can be achieved with kind of an analytical approach to the musical materials we use and the ways in which we use them. In our 21st century world, we now have lines of innovative thinking and technology that open the doors for this new expressivity. In other words, we are able to talk about abstract kind of intellectual ideas like the uncanny and even put them together with emotions. We can use music to embody all of this. I encourage composers and listeners and artists and audiences of all kinds to engage with this and try exploring some of these ideas. Oftentimes the artwork that's produced feels a little bit less accessible, and that is because we've left behind many of our traditional ideas and codified emotional cues that I mentioned at the beginning. But that's all the more reason for us to be questioning this art and to engage with it and to really listen and look carefully. By doing this, I feel that we are able to derive even more meaning out of the creative products of our culture. Thank you.